Afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at VCU, welcome to the November presentation of the Wilder School Lunch and Learn series. Today, we have a special presentation, Analyzing Election 2024 with Dr. Bob Holsworth and Dr. Robyn McDougle. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. The Wilder School offers a unique opportunity like this one for learning and growth with our monthly free virtual events. Each session features change agents, thought leaders, and policymakers who provide insights and commentary on relevant topics of the day, none more relevant than today's topic. My name is Stephen Dozier. I am the Senior Director of Development here at the Wilder School. And before we get started, I have a few announcements. First, the spring 2025 Wilder School Master's Application extended deadline is quickly approaching on December 1st, so submit your application or share this opportunity with someone you know as soon as possible. The fall 2025 Wilder School Ph.D. application deadline is December 15th. Follow the QR code for more information for both, or check the chat for more links. And it's time to celebrate. Join us for the fall 2024 Wilder School commencement on Saturday, December 14th at 1:30 in the Exhibit Hall C of the Greater Richmond Convention Center. And last but not least, there's plenty happening here at the Wilder School, so please check out the latest issue of the Wilder School in Action magazine. Without further ado, I now send it to our esteemed Dean of the Wilder School, Dr. Susan Gooden. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Welcome, everyone. I know we want to get right to it so we can all hear from Dr. Holsworth and his take on the election 2024, what that means for Virginia and what that means nationally. I do want to highlight and congratulate all of my colleagues here in the Wilder School because we do the Commonwealth poll, which is led by Governor Wilder and Robyn McDougle, who Robyn is serving as our moderator today. She's our Associate Dean of Research and Outreach. And we're really proud that our Commonwealth poll that we do was right on target in terms of the election results. So you see before you back in October what our findings were from the Commonwealth poll, which involves us calling citizens in Virginia and getting their opinions on a number of issues. And you saw about a 6-point spread that we predicted in October. Of course, this is a CNN recognized poll. You also see some of the top voting issues relative to immigration, cost of living, those types of things. And at the end of the day, our poll was correct in that Kamala Harris won over Donald Trump in Virginia. The actual results were 5.8%. Our poll had predicted a 6% spread. So right in the margin of error. So kudos. The Wilder School is very proud of our work with the Commonwealth poll and pleased to know that we are providing methodologically strong and very accurate information to policymakers across Virginia. So with that, I will hand it over to Robyn McDougle, who leads the Commonwealth poll, but is also leading our discussion with Dr. Holsworth today. Robyn.
Dean Gooden, thank you so much. It is my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Bob Holsworth, our speaker for today. Dr. Holsworth is a leading political analyst in Virginia. His comments on Virginia and national politics have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, and in major newspapers throughout the nation. Dr. Holsworth has appeared on major television channels across the United States and on the BBC, and is the regular political analyst for WTVR here in Richmond, Virginia. Dr. Holsworth was named one of the 100 influentials in Virginia politics by Campaign and Elections magazine, and is the author of 5 books, numerous articles, and publications on public policy and American politics. Dr. Holsworth was the founding director of the Center for Public Policy, which is housed here in the Wilder School, as well as being the founding director of the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs here at VCU. Dr. Holsworth has received VCU's Outstanding Teaching Award and Chev's Outstanding Faculty Award. He is currently a managing principal at DecideSmart, which is a firm that provides analysis and planning assistance to agencies, local governments, nonprofits, and corporate private sector companies with government interests. Dr. Holsworth has served on several boards and commissions, including chairing Governor Bob McDonnell's Independent Bipartisan Advisory Commission on Redistricting and serving as the executive director to Governor Warner's Commission on Efficiency and Effectiveness, along with being the director of Governor Wilder's Commission on the Future of Virginia's Urban Areas. Dr. Holsworth completed 2 terms on the Board of Visitors here at Virginia Commonwealth University, and for 5 years chaired the Great Aspirations Scholarship Program. He currently serves on the Executive Committee for RVA 757 Connects. Dr. Holsworth received his Ph.D. from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and truly we are honored to have you with us this afternoon, Dr. Holsworth. I'm going to turn the floor over to you because I know we have some very exciting participants ready to hear what you have to tell us about the elections that happened just a little over 2 weeks ago.
Great. Thanks very much, Robyn and Dean Gooden, for the opportunity to speak again with the group, and looking forward to everyone's questions. So what I'm trying to do today is to really give a little bit of a kaleidoscope of the election, both nationally and here in Virginia. So I'm going to start by talking about the backdrop to the national election, what happened, some of the implications that seem to be emerging right away with the cabinet choices, and then I'll move to what occurred here in Virginia and the implications therein for the upcoming election in 2025 in the Commonwealth, and then hope to take questions and comments from everybody in the audience here. So let me just begin with this election, which was very, very unusual in a number of ways. First, it looked as if we were going to have a rematch between President Biden and Donald Trump. I think I said last year, I really thought that the Democrats had to think seriously about that because of Biden's age and the manner in which he presented himself was going to be a challenge. He decided that he was going to, stick in this race, and they had that amazing debate in June where Biden really showed his age and showed that he was not very quick on his feet any longer. And ultimately, the Democrats pushed him out with a little more than 100 days in the race. And Donald Trump had really coasted to the Republican nomination. And so at that point, Kamala Harris had 100 days to put forward a campaign. From Trump's perspective, the campaign was going to be very, very similar to what he had been saying for over a year, and in some instances for 8 years. Actually, we've seen globally over the last couple of years, the 2 big issues that are driving elections had been the inflation, global inflation, and immigration. And these were 2 issues right at the heart of Trump's campaign. And in fact, the immigration issue had been at the heart of his campaign since 2016. Then thirdly, beyond those 2 issues, Trump talked, I think, a lot about some cultural issues, particularly if you watched the ads that were presented, you saw a lot of issues about transgender issues, a lot of concern about that put forward by the Trump campaign, using that quote from Harris, where she talked about the potential of using funds to for gender reassignment surgery for people who were imprisoned, with Trump noting that the commercial noting that she's for they and them, and he's for you. And in Virginia wasn't a battleground state, but those commercials were probably the ones that Virginians actually saw the most outside of Hampton Roads, because there were some commercials in Hampton Roads directed at North Carolina, but the rest of these were largely these national commercials that were in sporting events, appealing to young men in particular, I think, with this argument there. And then finally, Trump talked about Kamala Harris being too liberal, just sort of a general take on this particular argument about transgender folks. For Harris, she was, as I said, always had this sort of needle to thread from the get-go. And that was, on one hand, she wanted to be the candidate of change. She wanted to portray Trump almost as the cultural incumbent. but at the same time, she had to struggle with how did she present herself in terms of the Biden administration, where she was a part of that, and the Trump people were going to emphasize that. There's been a lot of talk about Harris. She should have done this or she should have done that. She didn't emphasize, she spent too much time with Liz Cheney. She didn't spend much time with progressives, or she didn't have, she didn't address the transgender ad specifically. And, there were certain glitches in the campaign. I think that response to the question on The View about what would you do different from the Biden administration, where she said, I couldn't think of much anything. But the reality was, I thought she did a pretty good job given the hand that she was dealt. And that hand was because Biden didn't get out of the race sooner. If he'd gotten out of the race a year earlier, we probably would have had a competitive primary. And in that competitive primary, Harris and other Democrats would have been able, I think, to make more distinctions from the Biden administration than they were able to do. At the end of the day, the challenge for Harris was significant because of that. She tried to emphasize reproductive rights. I think there was this real sense that because of the Dobbs decision, there was going to be a gender gap in this campaign that at the end of the day would favor women more so than men. That Harris tried to suggest that the economic plans of Trump, particularly the tariffs and others, wouldn't solve the inflation issue, and even worse, would be tilted toward the most affluent people in American society, where hers would be directed toward the middle class. She felt that. And then beyond that, I think she tried to use the argument that Trump himself had like Biden, had serious cognitive issues, and that in fact that he was unhinged, that he was dangerous, and that without what she called guardrails, because of the Supreme Court decisions about immunity, would be somebody that we would regret picking as president there. At the end of the day, however, what we saw was in some ways a very close election, but one that had very decisive outcomes and very decisive implications for what's going to happen over the next few years. And by and large, at the end of the day, Harris could not overcome the fact that Biden had a 40% approval rating, that almost 70% of the public said they were impacted either moderately or severely by inflation. And you had 2/3 of the public saying the country was moving in the wrong direction in that front. Interestingly enough, Donald Trump's approval rating was higher the day of the election in 2024 than it was the day of the election in 2020. You had about 49% of the public saying they remembered Trump's presidency as relatively good. And by and large, that was about the vote he got. So if you take a look at the exact vote in this race, the popular vote, the Democrats lost for the first time in a while, but it was very close. Trump's going to wind up with a slightly less, I think, than 50%, probably 49.9, 49.8. Harris is going to be somewhere around 48.3. So actually a fairly close election, but for the Democrats, all the battleground states broke in the direction of the Republicans. The 3 Rust Belt states were all close, less than 2 points, and Wisconsin less than 1. 2 to 3 point wins in Georgia and North Carolina, and then Nevada and Arizona. Trump did better and better than I think most of the polls thought he would be doing, at least in those 2 states on that front. One of the issues that's emerged in the analysis is that there's been a transformation of the Republican Party and the Republican Party voting base. That in particular, what you've seen is that under Trump, the Republicans are doing much better with working class voters, particularly white working class voters. And then beyond that, we saw in this election, Trump actually making very significant inroads with Latino voters. There was some sense before the election that he might make significant inroads with young Black males as well. I don't think that turned out to be the case in large numbers among the African-American population. Harris actually did a little better than Biden did in 2020 with women and a little worse with men. And so the percentage of the vote turned out to be a bit of a wash, but there was a decline in turnout in some key places. Philadelphia, Detroit, city of Richmond being another example of that the vote percentage didn't change, but the turnout and enthusiasm changed. I think a lot of Democrats were quite surprised that at the end of the day, Trump's success on the gender gap was that he had a larger margin among men than Harris did among women. And I think that was something that people did not perceive was likely to happen in this election going forward. I think there was a general sense that the reproductive rights issue was so strong for the Democrats and for independent voters that would help. But what we saw was that in a number of these states that had ballot initiatives on abortion, there were significant numbers of women who voted for the ballot initiative to do away with some of the restrictions on abortion in their states, but then at the same time voted for Donald Trump, that they felt comfortable doing both because they had the opportunity to make a statement and change the state policy, but at the same time may have voted for Trump on the economic grounds. So that's kind of where we were at the end of the day. One other thing I would mention about the transformation of the Republican base, it's pretty interesting. If you look at the states that have the highest educational attainment, there's out of the top 14 states, the Democrats win 13 of them. So the Democrats do extremely well with college educated and post-college educated voters. At the same time, they've been struggling more with working class, particularly white working class voters. And if you saw the messaging of the Trump campaign, there was much more of what some people have called the bro messaging than ever before. You saw Elon Musk having an outside role in the campaign. You've seen people doing the podcasts, Joe Rogan being very influential in the campaign, and Trump playing to that base and actually having some success there, not only with men in general, but with young men. And I would just note as an aside on the messaging side that's kind of interesting to me is last week I was in a classroom of a government club in a Chesterfield County high school. And at the end of it, I asked them, how many of you read a newspaper? And probably 60 kids, 0 read newspapers. I said, how many of you watch cable news? Maybe 3 or 4. I said, how many are on TikTok? Almost everybody. And how many of you know Joe Rogan? And maybe 3/4 of them. And the teacher told me, yeah, the guys like her, the girls don't, on that front. But it just shows that how to reach people and how do you message is very, very different. The Democrats relied on very traditional means. If you looked at the commentary in the last week of the campaign, they talked about how many millions of doors they knocked on. You saw these pictures of people getting on buses in New York to go knock on doors in Pennsylvania. And I'm not sure door knocking is actually probably any longer the best way to reach people and to get them motivated to vote on that front. So that's where we are. Trump now comes in office, and the question was like, what kind of president is he going to be? And if we look at the first cabinet picks, we're seeing that he's picking people who are absolute disruptors and who are not necessarily intended to be selected because of their previous administrative qualifications. That in fact, the first challenge he's making, in my mind, is to the Republicans in the Senate, basically saying you're going to swallow these people if you like them or not. And so you have this back and forth about Matt Gaetz, where certainly the Senate does not want to confirm him, but very interestingly, at least as of 11 this morning, no senator had publicly said on the Republican side is that I'm going to be the first to say no on that front. So they're playing a sort of game of chicken right now, and they're going to continue to play it with these other nominees, with the nominee for the Secretary of Defense, with the nominee for Tulsi Gabbard for head of DNI, and even with RFK Jr., who says he's going to go wild on health. on that front, even though part of his part of the things he believes are going to be anathema to the Republicans on the Agriculture Committee there, particularly when it starts talking about controlling various forms of industry there. So at the end of the day, it seems to me, I would say there are two variant of Trump voters there. One were sort of the what I would call the full MAGA voter who wants all the disruption, kind of enjoys watching this. And the second voter, which I think is fairly significant as well, is the voter who really just wanted the economy to be better, reduce costs, make their lives a little better. And by and large, presidents often overread their mandates. That's not uncommon. Trump has a very, very aggressive read of his mandate, largely because the Republicans control everything. They won the House. They by very small margin. They did flip the Senate, and they control the Supreme Court. So Trump's reading that very expansively so that I can do whatever I want. The question is, I think, how will the public react? There's a portion of the Republican base going to react positively to whatever he does. But at the same time, I'm thinking there's going to be some real reservations among the people who thought he wasn't going to do what he's obviously intending to accomplish here. So that's the U.S. The Virginia side is very interesting as well. In Virginia, Harris was able to carry Virginia by almost 6 points. That's down from Biden's 10 points and somewhat approximate what Clinton did in 2016 with 5 points. One of the things that happened across the country, though, when you look at the vote, almost 90% of the counties in the country moved toward the Republican side, moved more Republican. Didn't mean that they had a Republican majority, but they moved rightward in their direction. And very similar things happened in Virginia. There are very few counties and localities in Virginia that actually moved toward the Democratic side in this election compared to 2020. Two of the largest were a very small city, the city of Williamsburg, and probably the largest jurisdiction that moved that way was actually Chesterfield County, which was interesting here, where Harris carried that by probably 9.5 points. The rest of the state, almost every other place, you saw a move to the right. And what was interesting is that if you looked at the major metropolitan areas in Virginia, Hampton Roads moved to the right by maybe 3 points. RVA, if I just call Richmond, Chesterfield, Henrico, if I exclude Hanover from that, moved almost imperceptibly, a little bit to the right because the city of Richmond moved more than Henrico and Chesterfield. And then remarkably, the biggest move to the right in Virginia was in Northern Virginia, Fairfax County, Loudoun, Prince William, where they were near double digits. I think now that all the votes have come in Fairfax, are less than double digits, but these were significant movements there. And Democrats carried 2 congressional seats up there that were competitive, but by far less, I think, than they originally imagined they would on that front. So Virginia moved a little bit that way, but at the end of the day, the big movement, and I think the surprise in Virginia was Northern Virginia. So what do we make about that in Virginia going forward? What do we think this really means? I've talked to some Democratic leaders over the last few days, and a lot of them have a very optimistic view of what happened here in Virginia. They said, we just went back to the mean where we were with Clinton. We're going to do very, very well in 2025. There's nothing to see here, no big problem here. And maybe that's the case on that front. And one thing I would note about Virginia that's of interest is that over the past few years, or past decade or so, we've seen this huge regional divide in the vote. That if you're in the western part of the state, that's become more Republican. There's no rural Democrat any longer in the legislature. But at the same time, the Republicans have almost no representation in the big Northern Virginia counties on that front. So as the Democrats look at this and the Republicans look at 2025, they're trying to say, what does this election mean for 2025, and what's going to happen? The basic outlines of this look something like this, I think. The Democrats and the Republicans now seem to have their gubernatorial candidate. The Democrats have Abigail Spanberger, who was a successful ran many successful Congress races. She won both in districts centered in Western Henrico and Chesterfield, and a new district after redistricting centered in Eastern Prince William. She's raising a lot of money. She tends to have the same kind of general perspective that Democrats have in Virginia that have been successful, fairly moderate on economic issues, but at the same time, very progressive on the social issues there. So Spanberger is a candidate. Democrats has no opposition. They're pretty, they think she's going to do quite well. Republicans this week basically seem to have decided upon their candidate. The Attorney General Jason Miyares decided not to run against Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears. I think there may have been two reasons for that. One is that Sears is probably more popular right now with the Republican base than I think Miyares has, maybe a little better known. And then secondly, I think from the sense of the Republican side, if they had a very tough contest for the nomination, they would come out of it with no money, with no resources, and the nomination might not be worth as much as well. And Miyares might have decided those were two hills that combined were too steep to climb on that front. So the question about the gubernatorial race now, in my mind, is what does it look like? Does it look like what we've just seen, where Virginia is sort of a 5-point state that is basically Democratic? Or does it look a little more like 2021, when Glenn Youngkin was able to win by almost 2 points here in Virginia in that election? And the big deal in the gubernatorial race is this, that changes things somewhat as well. And that is, there's going to be far fewer voters at the gubernatorial year than the presidential year. We're going to wind up somewhere around 4.5 million voters in Virginia for the presidential race. And next year, we're likely to have something like 3.2, 3.3 million voters for the gubernatorial race. So what happens is that you just get, over 1 million voters don't show up. And the question is, who are those 1 million voters? Is it is it sort of equally distributed among the 5-point Democratic lead, or does those voters change a little bit? And I was looking at this last night, and I saw something somewhat interesting. I said that almost all the counties in Virginia moved a little bit righter than they were, and I was taking a look at some of the really Republican counties that I was giving a talk in Lynchburg this morning, so I was taking a look at what I call the Liberty University suburbs, Campbell and Bedford County. And what I found out is they moved right from 2020, and so they wound up with like 73, 74% of the vote was Republican. But when I looked at the Youngkin race in 2021, 78, 79% of that vote was Republican. So what that told me was that in 2021, the fall off from 2020 was clearly among Democratic voters who didn't show up. They of the 1 million plus voters who didn't show up, a much larger percentage of them were Democrats in 2021 than Republicans. And so if Winsome Sears has a hope in this race, it is that the similar dynamic occurs, that come 2025, the Democrats won't show up as much. However, I think there's a major factor militating against that, and that is simply Donald Trump. That the last time Trump was president in 2016, he ushered in the most impressive Democratic performance over the next 4 years for a generation. The Democrats won a gubernatorial race in a relative landslide with Ralph Northam. They then, 2019, took both control of the House and the Senate. And largely that was, if you talk to the legislators, they will all tell you it's because they ran good races. But that was because, in my mind, from Donald Trump, that he was on the top of the ticket and people were continuing to make these arguments against him. They weren't going to stop, and they did it there. I'm not sure, looking at the beginning of the Trump administration, that that's going to be that much different this time. That maybe it could be, but by and large, if he starts talking about cutting the federal workforce or relocating the federal workforce out of Washington, D.C., those are people who live in Northern Virginia in many respects. And I think that will be quite an anchor upon the neck of Republican candidates. Beyond that, I think Winsome Sears, as I said, has a lot of appeal to the MAGA base. She could potentially be the first African-American woman elected governor. There's some belief that maybe she could cut into the Democratic support among African-Americans there. I'm not sure she could, but there's certainly a belief that she might. And, obviously she's going to use some of the same issues that Youngkin and Trump used. I think you're going to see a lot more emphasis in Virginia in this race about transgender issues, particularly the issues of teenagers who are transitioning, playing in women's sports. You'll hear that. But at the same time, there's some liabilities that Sears has. I think she has a big liability in Virginia on reproductive rights. And while she'll be very appealing to the Second Amendment folks in Virginia, that picture of her with the assault rifle wrapped around her body is unlikely to be very helpful for her in the metropolitan areas of the state. I think Spanberger is a strong candidate. At the moment, I think her, we'll see how she defines and refines her message. Right now, it's very generic: safe communities, good schools, lower costs. I don't know what specifically that will actually mean. And I think her biggest challenge, going back to what I said about the drop off from the presidential race, is that she's never had to run a race where she was really dependent on a large mobilization of Democrats in the African-American community. She'll have to do that, I think, in 2025. So that's kind of where we are in the state on that race. Very quickly, on the legislature, there's 51 Democrats, 49 in the House. They're all up for re-election. I think if you just take a look at it right now, that looks better I'd rather be with the Democrats' hand than the Republicans, because they have, in the last election, and you looked at the really close elections, there were more Republicans who won close elections than the Democrats. Democrats won most of their elections handily. There are 4 or 5 Republican races that were very close that they won, that will be obvious targets for the Democrats in 2025. Finally, I'll just make one comment about the city of Richmond, that we had a mayor's race where Danny Avula won. He won, I think, 6 of the districts. Michelle Mosby won 3. There was some sense when we made those districts up originally, you had to win 5 of the 9 districts. The original intent was to ensure that the African-American community, which had a majority in those 5-9 districts, could have a chance of electing a candidate of their choosing. What happened in this race, however, was that Michelle Mosby didn't have, really, she'd been city council president, had the endorsement of some state senators, members of the General Assembly and city council people, but never really had a campaign that was geographically across the city of Richmond. Part of that might have just been bad campaign strategy, but part of that may be that she didn't raise much money. And so the 2 people who raised money was Danny Avula and then a young man named Harrison Roday. Roday spent $1 million, got 13% of the vote. Wasn't an auspicious beginning for him. I think he made a major mistake early on by not deciding to go on television but saying he was going to have door knockers. That didn't work. And Danny Avula was actually the most well-known candidate coming into this race. He had been health director, and beyond that, he had also been very involved in a lot of nonprofits for the last 15 years in Richmond and had a lot of support. And he had the most administrative experience. And at the end of the day, he won. So that's where we are. We're coming up to a big year in Virginia. There are a lot of people who say they hate the fact that Virginia has these elections every year, but this will be seen by the national press as the first election of 2026 coming up, both those House elections and the gubernatorial election. They're going to get a lot of attention. And as I always say, I love it because it's the political pundit full employment policy. So Robyn, I'd love to take any questions if people have some.
Yes, sir, they sure do. Thank you so much. That was outstanding, Dr. Holsworth. And so we have so many questions. I'm only going to ask one of mine because I want to get to the audience. And that's just around, one of the unique things about Virginia is that when it comes to our executive branch, we can split ticket. Do you think that if there were that 4 to 5 point difference, a narrower difference, and for example, Congresswoman Spanberger becomes the governor, is there any chance for a split ticket, specifically in the potential? We don't know who the Republican candidate will be for LG. We know there's a significant number of candidates running on the Democrat side, but about AG, since Attorney General Miyares did announce that he's running for re-election. Is there any chance of that anymore? I know we haven't seen it since Senator Kane's gubernatorial time, when we had a Democrat governor and a Republican lieutenant governor and attorney general.
Yeah, we've seen that over time in Virginia. That's been, it's not been inconsistent that we've done that. Mm-hmm. But again, what seems to be happening right now in general in politics is people a little more tribal on their side. Mm-hmm. We did see some split tickets in the presidential race. Actually, we saw it, all in North Carolina. We saw Trump win, despite the fact that many statewide candidates and other statewide candidates lost. So that's possible. But by and large, Glenn Youngkin brought 2 people in, and I just think that was a down the ticket vote. They voted for Youngkin, voted for that, and including knocking out a 2-term attorney general in Mark Herring on that side. So my guess is that I'd rather be on the winning ticket. I'd rather be on the ticket of the winning governor than the losing governor. But obviously, Jason Miyares feels that even if Winston Sears lost, he would still have that chance. The other thing I would just mention is that waiting your turn to try to run for governor has not been very positive in Virginia. Wasn't good for Mark Herring, wasn't good for Bill Bowling, wasn't good for Don Beyer. There's just a host, Mary Sue Terry, to go back in time, just been a host of people who have waited and found out that their time has passed by the time they try to gear up to run.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, now I'm going to turn over to the questions that we have, both those that were pre-submitted prior to the presentation by our audience, and then those of the audience questions that have come throughout your presentation. So the first one for you is, the incoming administration is known to be hostile toward academia and the Department of Education. What effects could that have on universities and public education in the coming months and years?
Yeah, there's a number of ways I think that this can have an impact. Well, first, they named Linda McMahon, the former WWE executive, as the head of education. Another person without any, I think she had served on a Connecticut Board of Education for a year, but somebody without obvious qualifications on the education side. And I think even in the comment, they say, well, they're going to go after woke things and like, and you've been seeing that also, I think, to some degree in Virginia with the governor's intervention with 2 universities in terms of their curriculum on race, as well as the intervention on the original standards about how Virginia is going to teach its history on that front. So I expect more of that. I expect to see some more emphasis on for-profit education. I intend to see more emphasis on credentialing in education. And so my guess is that, if you look at what you're seeing, I think you're seeing some degree of animus towards education, that's higher ed, that's likely to continue. particularly on the funding side. I think you're going to see funding, federal funds in some ways reduced. But I wouldn't say that's even solely connected to the Department of Education. I think probably any university that has a medical school or medical campus is just in trepidation right now about what Bobby Kennedy Jr. is going to do. And much of their funding comes from NIH. I think if you look at the largest single source of funding for Virginia Commonwealth University in terms of outside grants, it's National Endowment of Health. It goes primarily, but not entirely, to the medical campus there. But every university has that. And he has said that he wants to fire 600 people in NIH by day one. Now, again, I tend to think that's probably more hyperbolic than what he can do, because I think there's only really 20 political appointees in the agency. But at the end of the day, if there's a tremendous change in what is funded in science and what is funded in medicine, that's going to impact universities as well. So I expect, all kinds of different interests arising with NIH, NSF, and all of the things that fund university research. And at the same time, some continual concern about curriculum that we're seeing. And you're going to see some really battles with the states, where states like California or Maryland, Illinois, and because you're seeing claims of that if you don't go along with certain measures, we're going to, in some ways, remove the federal funding. I expect in Virginia to see even more efforts on the what's going to happen with the model policies on transgender kids in schools. That there are a couple of localities that have not gone along with that: City of Richmond, Fairfax County, and I would not be surprised if some of them are taken to court this year, not only because the governor believes that, but because it also becomes a political issue.
Gotcha. Well, since that was a pre-planned question from our attendees before we got here today, I want to go to one of the questions from our audience. Given your experience with efficiency task forces, what are your thoughts on the impact of Elon Musk on efficiency, or, for example, budget cuts in the federal government? Will there be a trickle down to state governments and taxpayers?
Yeah, well, I think there'll certainly be a trickle down. And, my sense of this is that it's been fascinating to watch this sort of bromance between Trump and Musk. And it seems to still be going pretty strong, though among a lot of Trump advisors, they wish it wouldn't be on that sense. That, my sense is that, they're going to make a lot of proposals, but it's really the Congress that would have to do this in many instances, I think, as they think about this. And so the question then becomes, where do you cut and what do you cut? And, some of the initial thoughts about, work programs for Medicaid, that states have had the opportunity to do that for many years. I think only one state's put them really into effect, which was Arkansas, and it hasn't had that much of effect. And so my sense is that to the extent that they cut safety net programs or propose cutting safety net programs or entire agencies, I don't think that works well in Virginia, first of all. And then secondly, again, this becomes a question of the Republican base is now among working class people, many of whom use Medicaid, particularly in the rural areas, as their primary source there. I mean, Medicaid just doesn't cover people who are not working. It covers a lot of people who are working. And so my sense is that I think Republicans have to be somewhat careful as they take out this knife to ensure that they don't begin to attack the very people that got them elected.
All right. Well, I've got a question that actually reaches into our international thoughts. So I'm a VCU faculty member currently in Riga, Latvia. The Baltic states are worried about NATO's effectiveness and the US role. Is US involvement in NATO going to have an impact? what will the incoming president and legislative branch do with regards to NATO's involvement?
Yeah, well, I think the first issue there with NATO is obviously going to be Ukraine on that sense. I do think that there's a general sense that Ukraine, that the war in Ukraine just can't go on the way it's going on for many more years, that there has to be some negotiation. And then the question becomes, where is that negotiation? So incoming President Trump has said, well, I'll just settle this in 24 hours. I'm not sure that's easily settleable that way. And, you know, I think I saw a poll of Ukrainians the other day that basically said they'd much rather have NATO and the EU negotiating for them than President Trump with Putin. And then the question becomes, you know, how does Putin react to this in some fashion as well? Because if you're saying, well, I'm going to, you know, if he sees an American president who may say, well, I'll defund Ukraine and, you know, I'll do there, you know, does he just say, oh, great, I can't wait to work with Donald Trump? Or does he get emboldened by saying, you know, I'm winning now, that they're pulling out? So again, I think there's some impetus to negotiate. And the question is going to be, it's not going to be an easy negotiation. What's the final outcome? Is there a demilitarized zone? And I think the Europeans are going to have to be involved in it. But the broader question is that Donald Trump may not have the same view of foreign policy that we've seen in American society for the last 80 years, which is America and Europe sort of against the autocrats of Russia and maybe more so China today, that by and large, I think Trump sees the world as one where the strong autocrats kind of get together and make the decisions about that. And I think that's leaving a lot of people in Europe, and I think the countries that were previously either inside the Soviet Union or a target of the Soviet Union quite anxious, because it's going to require a greater effort on the part of the NATO countries to defend them than we might have seen previously.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so I want to switch back to one of our current audience questions and kind of looking at this, back to this role of the economy. As you remember, of course, Dean Gooden pointed out that our Commonwealth poll pointed out that the economy was one of the #1 drivers. You've kind of alluded to it throughout the presentation. So the question is, do you think the economic voters who voted for Trump will now be voting for Republicans moving forward, or are they transactional and will continue to vote for whoever they think will improve the economy regardless of party?
Yeah, I think there's probably some mixture there. I think there are probably some people who've gone over to the Republican side on that and will remain there. But I do think there's a lot of transactional stuff here, because I just think that there's a large swath of the American public that doesn't watch politics in the same way that the insiders watch politics, that they basically spend their lives doing other things. They're not watching the cable news. They're not watching the arguments in many, many ways. They just don't do that. And so my sense is that they're looking for outcomes on that. And these aren't the easiest outcomes to accomplish. And if you look at what's happening with the Treasury pick right now that has taken a while to make, it exposes or reveals some of the difficulties that going forward. Because on one hand, the president wants somebody who is full scale behind tariffs. On the other hand, he doesn't want to spook the market, as they say. He doesn't want to get the market upset, because most economists believe that's inflationary. That's not going to reduce costs. They're going to elevate costs in some fashion. So I think that's the challenge that the president has, that by and large, the economy is probably running more smoothly today than it was certainly during the COVID time. The Biden people like to point out what they've done with the CHIPS Act, what they've done with the Infrastructure Act. It's provided a lot of jobs and high-paying jobs for people. But at the same time, even with inflation down to 2 to 3%, there's a lot of the public that feels that prices were still too high. Rents are very high. They can't buy a home. And so these are more intractable issues. And my sense is that, to think that this was simply a mandate about MAGA is an overreach. That there's part of that, but that's not that doesn't get you to 50%. And I think the part that gets to 50% were more the transactional folks who'd like to see their lives improved and some improvement on areas that have been relatively intractable. And we'll have to see whether the Trump administration has any success in addressing them. But it's not apparent that all the strategies that they propose will do so.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be an interesting 4 years, exactly as you said, and how the working class and what we identify as the working class and their needs start to kind of engage and play out. Well, you did point out in Virginia, kind of taking it back here to the Commonwealth, that we have 2 women being nominated potentially as our gubernatorial candidates on both sides of the aisle. And so this question then says, there's been a lot to be made about the fact that clearly the vice president, and being African American, but most importantly, being the first African American woman to run for president. There have been some questions around gender, and in the United States, is a woman being president something that the voters at large in the United States are not yet ready for? Or does it tie more specifically to the things that we've talked about today around issues, situations, policies, and conditions? But it's a really, I think, a really great question when we look at Virginia next year, because in all intents and purposes, we will have a woman as head of the Commonwealth of Virginia. So good question for you on the United States.
I mean, what I'd say there are just a couple of things, Robyn. The first is that the election, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. So it's hard for me to say that the Americans aren't ready for that. Kamala Harris is going to come within 1.5 points of the popular vote. So I think that certainly suggests that it's potential. And they ran very different races, though. I mean, Hillary Clinton emphasized the historic nature of her race. Kamala Harris didn't mention it, basically, on that front. But the outcome for them was somewhat similar. I do think there are some people who certainly see the world that way. I don't know. I don't think it's prohibitive of Virginians or Americans electing a woman. But certainly, I think there was a greater emphasis on this bro vote, this very clear masculinity that came up. I think, from the day of the Republican convention, when I saw Hulk Hogan there, and he showed up again, around election eve or something like that. So I saw more of that was there. I think Harris and their campaign thought that they had effectively countered that with the issue of reproductive rights, and the women were going to do well, and ultimately the Republicans did a little better. But I do think it's an issue with some people, but I don't think it's absolutely prohibitive in that sense, because we've seen women get elected increasingly to governorships where they had been struggling at one time because they supposedly didn't have the quite executive capacities. We're seeing a lot of that. We saw some women be very successful in the Senate races this time. So I'm optimistic about that, but I at the same time wouldn't suggest that there aren't barriers that still emerge in those races.
Great. Well, with our last question today, being that we're the #1 school of public affairs here in the Commonwealth of Virginia and in the top 15% in the country, it would be good to end with, what is the future of professionals in public administration as we're looking at this efficiency and, potential reduction in the government workforce? How does that reflect on the future of our professionals in the field of public
that's
administration?
a great question. I think the biggest challenge actually is the politicization of everything. That professionals in public administration really want to emphasize efficiency. They want to make government and nonprofits work better. They really try to minimize the level of political interference and try to do their best without that. I think that the biggest challenge right now are folks who want to politicize the various administrations. Virginia, for example, has always been conceived as one of the best managed states in the country. And while governors always take the credit, I think a lot of it is often dependent upon the quality of the state workforce, which in my experience has been absolutely superbly professional for a long period of time. So I'm more worried about the politicization. Typically, I think that's less prominent at the local level, the people who are working at counties and the like. But certainly at the federal level, it's becoming more, it's becoming a dramatically challenging issue as the Trump administration essentially suggests that what it wants to do is to fire a lot of civil servants by redefining their work and replacing them with people who have greater political allegiance. I'm worried about that, and I'd be worried about that as the future of public administration, because I don't think that would be very good for the country.
Well, as we always say, DC can always learn a thing or two from the Commonwealth of Virginia. And, every 4 years we have another executive branch. So, our state workforce truly is exactly what you said, the utmost professionals. So, Dr. Holsworth, thank you so very much for spending your time with us this afternoon, giving us some real insights into not only the national outcomes from 2024, but how that can impact what we're going to see in Virginia in 2025, and then really throughout the country and the world for that matter. So thank you so much.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity to be with everybody, Robyn.
Yes, sir. Stephen, I will turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Dr. McDougle. Thanks, Dr. Holsworth. What an amazing session today. I thank everyone who was able to participate, share their questions. Thank you again to our communications team in the background who was working diligently to make this event happen. Thank you to Dean Gooden. For those of you who join us at these sessions each month, I will let you know that we do not host a lunch and learn session in December. Happy holidays. We will see you again on the other side of the new year, January 15th, save the date, where we will have a member of Mayor-elect of VULA's executive leadership team. That should be a good one. So please save the date. And we look forward to seeing you then. Last but not least, happy holidays to everyone. And we appreciate your time and look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you for choosing to spend your lunch with us.